Please pray with me. Holy One, who by a word created, may these human words I speak reflect your creative genius, reflect your caring heart. Amen. So, Rachel Held Evans was a treasure. She was a Georgia girl raised in the Bible Belt whose faith outgrew its childish shell. But instead of abandoning God and religion and faith like so many do, she turned it until she could wrestle from it a fluid, resilient, abundant faith. And with the panache of a gifted writer, which she was, she began to share this with the world with a few books before a freak illness took her life last year at the age of 34. I miss her, and we will all miss the wisdom that would have flowed into her writing had she lived. In her last book, this one, Inspired, which we studied earlier this year, she midrashes this text. She tells a story about the story. She minds the gap that's right here on the very first page. Let's see if I can do this. This gap, before it all begins. She wonders, why does the Bible start there with this story, not any other story? Now, when you notice a gap like that, you've got to do some digging. She wasn't an academic theologian. She was the mother of 2 tiny children. So she went at the task with all of the focus of a woman short on time. She asked, who wrote it, when, why? And this is important, more important than ever. What she discovered, and what lots of theologians have known for a long time but never really bothered to make a big deal out of it, is that even though the story is placed here right at the very beginning of the book, it's actually written down very late in Israel's history, probably in the 500s before the Common Era. So in other words, long after the story it describes. So that's the when, but what about the why? Why does any group tell stories? Why do they tell the stories of our origins? So I remember when I was a kid, my father was involved in this fascinating research project where they interviewed mostly very old women who had been in service decades before. Now, those of you who are Downton Abbey lovers know that the phrase in service refers to all of those housemaids and butlers and footmen and scullery maid who lived in the grand houses, making these houses work, though they were behind the scenes and most often noticed and certainly never really the topic of history. But this entire practice, lifestyle of service in grand houses waned very quickly after the end of the First World War, and by the 1970s, almost all of them had died. And so the very few who were left alive, it was important to gather their stories, for someone to listen and record them and write them down before they were lost forever. We tell origin stories, those way back when stories, when there's a good chance that we'll run out of time. We tell them, we write them down when something threatens the present or the future, when some great crisis or upheaval threatens our existence. We tell them when the present we thought would last forever is ended. And so we look back in order to make sense of our presence, in order to recall that there was once a future, a hope that shaped us. So what Rachel Held Evans discovered about this creation story, this ultimate origin story, was that it was told recorded and written down to be passed on at just such a time in Israel's history, when everything they knew was over, ended. And I have lost my place because I overscrolled. Israel was no longer on the map. Israel, whose identity had been forged in the belief that a God, called Yahweh, had this special place for them in creation among the nations, except they weren't there anymore. All of the people of Israel who had actually survived the earlier Assyrian invasions had now been scattered, or worse, carted off in chains by the mighty Nebuchadnezzar to become slaves again, this time in Babylon. You know that Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. And when our captors told us to sing, we said, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Well, how indeed. If you think about it, this is an identity crisis of epic proportions. And to compound it, what is left of Israel, huddled as they are in the ghettos, the townships, the reservations, all on the wrong side of the river Euphrates, they are being bombarded with competing theologies, religions. And so it's not surprising that they wondered if their God had abandoned them, or was punishing them, or maybe worse, was Yahweh, their God, even capable of protecting them against these seemingly more potent deities of the conquerors and the masters who now held them slaves? So, to these questions, or perhaps around these questions, woven like silken threads, the wise ones, the spirit-breathed ones, the elders, the mystics, they wove words of wonder, saying, Israel, Judah, America, Canada, Cedar Park, remember. Remember how in the beginning God breathed. God brooded over a chaos more primordial than even our troubled times. And God created order, beauty, goodness from the mishmash and the mess. Remember. Remember God, whose very name is beyond naming, who spun stars and suns and moons and planets out of nothing more tangible than a dream, that this God made us, every human creature of every color, of every race, of every gender, of every age, of every ability, size, with wit and will and wisdom enough to remember that we are part of a beloved, a loving part of a story that is so much grander, larger by billions of years than whatever present catastrophe we find ourselves in. And so the remembering of the beginning after the ending begins. They, whoever they were, the survivors of that Babylonian hell about 500 years before our brother Jesus was born to Mary, put this story first so that all in every generation since who managed to actually open the book they're holding might remember. That it all begins with the living, longing, loving, creative, redemptive breath of God. When we begin there, the stories, Israel's stories, the prophet's stories, Jesus' stories, Paul's stories, your stories, all stories, our stories, They all fall into their proper place of beginnings after endings, of forgiveness after sin, of life after death, of healing after sickness, of reconciliation after centuries of systemic domination. The question that remains, though, is whether we will let the power of this story shape us and change us, challenge us, create and recreate us again and again and again, as often as it takes for one human race, created in the image of God, to care and tend for this one blessed creation. I hope you'll agree that our answer would be yes. Amen.